welcome everyone to Skagit Land Trust's speaker series. My name is Sarah Gardam, and I am the newish outreach coordinator here at Skagit Land Trust. And I'm very excited to be helping to host this speaker series online so that members who can't always drive to our events or go on a big hike or work party can still be part of our community. So we'll work on getting this Zoom even more accessible for everyone as we move forward with the speaker series, just working out a few initial glitches. So you're getting in at the ground level. This is our first talk, and we're hoping to see you back here for some of the more great talks that we'll be having this spring, and then again in the fall as the weather starts to get cold and dark again. We're very excited to be able to learn as a community tonight and be students of history, guided by our wonderful historian and friend of the trust, Theresa Trebon. I'll do the Zoom logistics first, though. So we have nearly 200 people registered for this event. So we have turned your video and audio off to avoid distractions and issues that might arise. So please send your messages to the Zoom host through the chat function, and our development director, Laura, will sort through your questions and bring them to Theresa at the end of her presentation for her to discuss with you. So I want to start by acknowledging that the lands conserved and protected by Skagit Land Trust have been inhabited and stewarded by numerous tribes and Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. And we recognize and respect the inherent treaty rights of the Coast Salish people who have a deep and abiding connection to this place. Tribes within Skagit County include the Samish Indian Nation, the Sauk-Suattle tribe, the Swinomish Indian tribal community, and the Upper Skagit Indian tribe. The Lummi Nation, Nooksack tribes, Stillaguamish tribe of Indians, and the Tulalip tribes also have ancestral and continued connections to this area. I hope that we can all learn from history tonight and pay respect to the elders, tribal leaders, and members of each sovereign nation who continue to honor these lands through their traditions that have been passed down through the generations. So a little bit about Skagit Land Trust. It's a 501c3 nonprofit accredited land trust founded in 1992 by three visionaries who saw the value of protecting the Skagit and saw what factors might be threatening it coming down in the future. Our mission here is to conserve wildlife habitat, wetlands, agricultural and forest lands, scenic open space, and shorelines for the benefit of our community and as a legacy for future generations. And our tagline fittingly is saving land for tomorrow. We've conserved over 10,000 acres of land in Skagit County, and we usually do this by purchasing and accepting donations of land and conservation easements, and by assisting partners and agencies with land conservation projects. Some of our most successful projects have protected habitat areas across private ownership boundaries, helping residents, ranchers, farmers, businesses to be part of a wider protection network. So partnership is a really important value in with the trust and an important part of our practice. Speaking of values, these are some of the other things we value. Sound ecosystems, the basic understanding that a high quality of life requires diverse and resilient ecosystems. Sustainable stewardship, we commit to long-term sustainability and when we care for the lands that we protect. And we have a wonderful community of engaged volunteers who help us at all different levels of the organization. And I must say, it's been very impressive as I've onboarded at Skagit Land Trust and met some of our volunteers. They really are next level, I would say. We also have involved members at large and community members that we partner with and who get to come to our events. Offering free events for the community is really important to us as well. We collaborate as best we can with a diverse array of people, communities, and organizations, trying to work towards common goals. And we also value integrity. We adhere to the highest ethical standards in carrying out our mission, and we strive for transparency in our operations and in our decisions. Our vision at Skagit Land Trust is to have a connected Skagit where people live in harmony with their natural environment And that's because it is all connected, right? Just as these stunning images on your screen show. Um, and I was thinking about this and realizing, this is just as true about ecosystems, that they're all connected, that everything's connected, as it is about history. And that will become really clear as Theresa speaks to us tonight. So I want to bring us to the topic of tonight's talk, the history of environmental change in Skagit County. And Theresa is a historian who has worked to preserve and interpret Pacific Northwest history for over 30 years. She's the author of First Views, An Early History of Skagit County, among other books. And her work may be found in various collections: Ebby's Landing NHR, the Nordic Heritage Museum, the Anacortes Museum, Collection for Pacific Northwest Studies, and the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community, where she served as their first archivist from 2007 to 2022. And I have to add here that Theresa has volunteered huge amounts of time to a pretty fascinating and years-long archival project for Skagit Land Trust at one of our properties. And we are really forever in her debt for that. So thank you so much, Theresa. And we're really excited to hear from you tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you to greet everyone and pull up your presentation when you're ready.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome for coming tonight to this look at environmental change in Skagit County. I'm grateful to your attention tonight and also to the Skagit Land Trust for sponsoring this forum. Many of us who live in the Skagit Valley treasure it for its immense beauty and open space. But immense change has also taken place here in the short 165 years since non-native settlement. In the 30 years that I've researched history at places like Ebby's Landing, the Anacortes Museum, and for the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community, I have been continually struck by the rapidity of change in our region. Although the mid-1800s, when non-native settlement began, is seemingly a long time ago, it has been but the blink of an eye. Hold on just one sec because there we go. Thank you. As I've shared regional history across the state, I've often sensed from people this notion of why bother to study history. It's over, it's past. But the value in studying history is summed up by this magnificent statue in front of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. What is past is prologue, is engraved on the base. One of those great phrases that kind of sums it all up. It is important to study what came before in order to understand how we got to today and where we're going in the future. For our journey into the past this evening, salmon will be our touchstone, for salmon is the Skagit's canary in the coal mine. For thousands of years, this was the homeland of indigenous communities whose descendants still live here today. Their occupation stretches back over 11,000 years, probably longer. In the wintertime, multiple families lived in substantial cedar longhouses in villages along the coastline. In the spring and summer, they canoed to seasonal camps among the islands to gather bulbs and shellfish, living in sturdy cattail mats as they harvested the bounty of the Salish Sea. Their existence regarded the natural world as equally important as themselves, intricately woven into their spiritual and daily existence. It was a far cry from what was coming. These first people used bone, shell, wood, and stone, some made of obsidian traded north from Central Oregon, to craft highly functional tools, structures, and clothing. They crafted structures like this fish weir out of yew and maple, a design that allowed juvenile salmon to escape while trapping the larger salmon that they dried for winter months. And it's really amazing because in the 1990s, as the city of LaConner was repairing some underground pipes in town, they came across the remains of one of these at an intersection. And It's now in the Swinomish archive, but it was a pretty amazing find. The indigenous population not only utilized the Skagit's rich forests and shorelines, but also its alpine areas for hunting. Native cooking hearths have been found on the shores of Lake Ross underneath the ash of Mount Mazama, the volcanic eruption that created Crater Lake over 5,000 years ago. Indians also manipulated their environment. They built clam gardens along the shore to encourage shellfish growth, and they used fire. They regularly burned over areas to encourage the growth of berries, camas, and bracken fern, and to create browse areas for hunting game. This practice created landscapes like March Point and Aby's Prairie, a practice that continued after the contact period with settlers in the mid-1800s, as this quote notes. Newcomers began arriving in the 1500s, creating the first written accounts of indigenous life. First came the Spanish in 1592. And contrary to their accounts of discovering virgin lands, they entered a region where human occupations stretched back millennia. The British came next. In 1792, the Vancouver expedition entered local waters and took possession of all land and waters for England. They brought a new concept, one foreign to the native population: ownership of land. And something else, diseases for which the native community had no immunity. Vancouver noted deserted villages along the Sound, habitations which had fallen into decay, amongst which were found human skulls and other bones scattered about, the ill too sick to bury their dead. Evidence of how natives dealt with their environment in a healthy way may be found at this juncture. While it's impossible to reconstruct exactly how they did so, as our wet climate does not preserve evidence of wooden structures and plant material, the lack of certain diseases gives us a clue. Experts have concluded that diseases like smallpox, which resulted in a mortality rate of up to 80% in some native villages, cholera, typhoid, and 15 other communicable diseases were not present in this region at the time of European arrival, signaling that natives knew how to take care of their environment. The next wave of change soon followed. In 1810, 5 years after Lewis and Clark discovered the West, the fur traders arrived. They founded the first non-native settlement in Washington at Fort Spokane. Industrial extraction of resources soon began. By 1824, these fur traders were canoeing up the Swinomish Channel in search of furs. Natives in this area now saw infiltration of their homeland from the east and the west, yet offered assistance and guidance. The Hudson's Bay Company soon established forts in the Puget Sound region, starting at Fort Vancouver in 1824 and proceeding north to the Fraser River and Victoria. The native population began adapting to this new market-based economy, one that was radically different from the one that they had always known, one that was based on a traditional use by the community of natural resources. This 1847 ledger page from Fort Nisqually records this change as the Skagit tribe, not spelled the same, visited the fort and traded the items on the left side of the page for goods on the right. Dried salmon, cattail mats, raccoons, and muskrat for ammunition, fabric, buttons, and looking glasses. This 1841 map from the U.S. exploring expedition is one of the earliest views of the Skagit from this time period and tells many stories. The expedition was mapping the Northwest coast in anticipation of the land becoming part of America, and they renamed Spanish sites from earlier maps. For example, here in the middle, you can see Perry's Island, which the Spanish had named Fidalgo, but the expedition renamed for a hero of the War of 1812. That name would flip back to Fidalgo, but it was not the case for thousands of native place names that were given European ones, names that often described the land's environmental characteristics and were necessary signs for those canoeing on local waters trying to find their way. In 1846, the US and Great Britain divided Oregon Territory via the Oregon Treaty, which granted America all land south of the 49th parallel. Native communities who did not recognize international boundaries and who had families scattered across this region now lived under three forms of government: the British, American, and their own traditional way. But even before these boundaries were drawn, settlers from the east were crossing the Oregon Trail for free land here. Farmers, loggers, miners, and more, each seeking new economic opportunities in these supposedly unsettled lands of the West. The first wagon party reached Puget Sound in 1845 and founded New Market, now known as Tumwater. The 1850 Oregon Donation Land Claim Act accelerated the influx of newcomers. It promised 320 acres of free land to settlers, or 620 if they were married. And over 500 of those claims were filed along the shores of Puget Sound, the water highway for water and for commerce and communication. Settlers chose the most desirable properties to file on, such as Eby's Prairie, that landscape created by native use of fire. It proved perfect for agriculture. And this map of central Whidbey that you see here on the left shows the number of claims taken around Penn Cove, all of them filed and settled before any treaty negotiations with Indians had commenced. A dramatic change of worlds rapidly followed, where natives once roamed freely in search of food and resources. Boundaries arose and restrictions followed. Non-native settlement began in the Skagit country in 1853 at March Point. The year before, newcomer Jared Fox had canoed up the Swinomish Channel and observed, here are thousands of acres of flats. When the tide is full, you could pass all about it for miles with canoes. Ducks and fowl abound for hunting, and the Indians get any amount of fish, especially salmon. But as this letter illustrates, once settlers arrived, the native world changed. A once rich site of camas fields near today's Keystone Ferry Landing became fodder for pioneer livestock. Not until January 1855 did the United States open treaty negotiations with the First People. The Treaty of Point Elliott, conducted at Mukilteo. Tribal leaders from the Skagit were there, although the Upper Skagit did not come, possibly because it was January and freezing cold and a long way to go. Negotiations passed from English to Chinook trading jargon to Lushootseed, the native tongue, and back again. It is unclear if the tribes understood the magnitude of what they were giving away. The Point Elliott Treaty, which is highlighted by the blue bars in the upper center of the map here, took native lands from Pierce County to the Canadian border, from the west side of the Cascades to the Sound. What was reserved for Indians in this agreement between sovereign nations was hunting rights and half the salmon catch, which they could catch in their usual and accustomed places. Why? Because treaty negotiators did not want to feed their new wards. An ample food supply existed on land and sea, and they could feed themselves. 3 years after the treaty, the Skagit watershed and its resources was mapped in detail, noting native villages along the river's shoreline. 8 years after the treaty, the transformation of the historic Skagit Delta began. It started on the Swinomish Flats, where newcomers transformed the tide prairies, as they were called, into farmland. By 1879, over 10,000 acres had been diked and converted to agricultural lands. The tidal areas mapped here by the U.S. exploring expedition 20 years earlier and marked by the arrows on this map were gone. Eventually, over 80% of the Skagit estuary would be covered over. And the rich sloughs which crisscross them, the nursery for juvenile salmon, the arteries for one of the richest salmon habitats in the world, had been filled in. In 1858, surveying commenced in the region. You can see the tip of Whidbey Island sticking out in the map in the upper left with the survey lines on it, and that's where it began. But as the lone surveyor traveled through the Skagit country, Dominic Hunt was murdered on the Swinomish Channel. 2 Native men were arrested, tried, and hung in Whatcom County. Decision that failed to comprehend what surveying actually meant to the Native population and their homeland. The county's first survey crew, complete with an unnamed Indian, began delineating range and township in 1872. Newcomers to the Skagit country accelerated as they could now file claims with the government. Diking operations moved north to the Samish Flats, accelerating the transformation of historic tide prairies and ancient salmon habitat. And on the heels of diking came the next environmental impact, logging. The first logging camp began on Samish Island in 1867, where a surveyor estimated that the average acre supported over 300,000 board feet of timber. Logging camps rapidly spread into the Skagit Valley, impacting stream health as ancient forests fell. By 1889, the pace of harvesting had so accelerated that a local newspaper urged calm, stating, "There is no reason for alarm at the prospect of the early destruction of our timber supply. The forests are so vast that even though sawmills have been ripping 500 million board feet of lumber out of them every year for the past 10 years, the openings made so far are mere garden patches. At the present rate of consumption, there is enough for 1,000 years." Only one thing thwarted the upriver extraction of resources: these 2 massive log jams on the Skagit River near present-day Mount Vernon. Indians had tried to prevent settlers from going around the jams for years and keep them out of the upper Skagit country, but pioneers wanted the rivers cleared and the country opened up. By 1877, the dams had been removed, and the first steamer, the Fanny Hill, traversed the north and south forks of the river up to Mount Vernon. The local newspaper proclaimed, "This opens the gateway." The Indian population upriver was not pleased, however, and they did their best to thwart additional surveying efforts. But by 1889, steamers were able to reach the mouth of the Sauk River, where a new industry had begun 10 years earlier: mining, led by prospectors looking for a duplication of the 1858 Fraser River gold rush in British Columbia. By 1879, the Ruby Creek gold rush was on, a site now under Ross Lake. Mining surged in the upper Skagit. By the 1890s, prospectors were packing in hydraulic hoses and nozzles to blast away layers of topsoil in the search for valuable minerals. Meanwhile, flushing tons of silt and debris into streams that fed the Skagit watershed. Downstream, Skagit County towns were rapidly growing: LaConner, Edison, Mount Vernon, and Cedar Woolley. By 1890, the county's population stood at almost 9,000. One of the biggest and fastest transformations was Anacortes in January of 1890, just a tiny village of 40 people on Guaymas Channel. But 5 months later, rumors of a transcontinental railroad had spread, one that would make Anacortes its Pacific terminus, the New York of the Pacific, the gateway to the Orient. And the population swelled to over 2,000. The city soon boasted 5 lumber mills and 6 salmon canneries lining the shores of Fidalgo Bay and Guaymas Channel. All of these industrial sites dumped their share of toxic effluent into the salt water that surrounded Fidalgo Island. Several of the town's canneries, like the Fidalgo Island Canning Company, located at the site of today's San Juan Island ferry dock, were among the largest canneries in the world. The canneries relied on fish traps, industrial fish traps, that would prove deadly to Puget Sound fisheries. And for those of you who have never seen a fish trap or don't understand how they work, this diagram explains it. The shore is on the right, that curvy line, and every spring they would drive piling out a mile from shore, and from that piling would drop heavy industrial strength chain link fencing that fell down to the seabed floor, and then construct this outer heart and inner heart at the end. And so as salmon came in from the outer sea to head up to the rivers to spawn, they would come in and they would hit these mile-long wire walls, turn and go into the trap, into the outer heart and the inner heart, and eventually the spiller, where they were gathered up, sometimes 6,000 to 8,000 in a single haul, often multiple times a day during the salmon runs. And they were placed in scows and taken back to the canneries in Anacortes. Fears for the salmon industry had been sounded 20 years earlier in 1877, after just 10 years of industrial fishing and canning on the Columbia River, where the salmon runs suddenly collapsed. It prompted the Seattle Intelligencer to report, "We can see by the failure of the salmon run on the Columbia River that unless we are protected by laws, our fisheries will languish and decline whenever prosecuted above a reasonable extent. They should be protected against extermination by laws that prohibit the erection of traps which do not allow young salmon to swim through, fish that are useless for canning and are consequently thrown away as dead waste. If taken in its infancy, this industry can be easily protected and made valuable to generations that are yet unborn." Fish traps enabled Anacortes to make the stunning newspaper claim in 1913, boasting that the town's 6 canneries produced 700,000 cases, or more than 33 million cans of salmon. They stated this awesome production could fill 813 railroad cars, a train that would stretch 6 miles. And if the cans were laid out, they would stretch from Anacortes to Chicago. As this 1930 map shows, the fish traps, which were gold mines for their owners, lined the shores of Puget Sound. The close-up on the right shows you the trap locations that surrounded the waters of Skagit County. But around this time, the first glimmer of environmental concern arose, led by club women who were alarmed at the destruction of the natural world surrounding them. It started with the simple rhododendron. In 1892, in a special statewide election, more than 15,000 women chose the coast rhododendron as the state flower. Anacortes soon proclaimed a Rhododendron Day each May, the first event in the county seemingly dedicated to the environment or a part of it. Special excursions were made to Cypress Island to gather the rhodie's flowers. But this special attention to the blooms had unexpected consequences. Wholesale stripping of the evergreen shrubs, prompting a warning in the paper to roadie vandals to stay away. They just went elsewhere. The newly minted Deception Pass Ferry used rhododendrons as a way to sell tickets, establishing parks on Whidbey where ferry goers could go and pick the blossoms unimpeded. Local club women raised the alarm over the disappearance of green space in Skagit County. They were members of a nationwide club movement that allowed women to move from the private sphere of the home into public life, where they had some influence and sway through their club work. National agendas were set on issues from childcare to food safety to protecting natural spaces. The local club women of Skagit County followed suit. And as you can see, there was a considerable number of them. One of their missions here to protect the trees in the region by creating parks for future generations, including Little Mountain Park here in Mount Vernon and Washington Park in Anacortes. And although their husbands often got the headlines and credit, club women's influence, only now coming to light, often was the driving force. One such example is Douglas Allman, shown here in the lower right-hand corner, who led the effort to create Deception Pass State Park. Even though he got the public credit and his picture in the paper, I strongly suspect it was his wife, Cora, an avid club woman, who was the boot in her husband's behind. Meanwhile, upriver, at the confluence of the Baker and Skagit rivers, a new industry got underway in the 1890s with the discovery of limestone deposits. Concrete soon became the order of business. The plants at Concrete discharged their waste directly into the Baker River and poured toxic dust into nearby waterways and on everything else. Locals told of clotheslines and vegetable gardens coated with white dust, of cars seemingly painted so thick that you could write your name on the windows. Sources of new power were needed for this industry, and dams became the answer. The first was on the Baker River, built in 1906 to power the 2 cement plants that rose on its shores. Investment speculators, Investment speculators, many from Seattle, soon realized the hydroelectric potential of the Upper Skagit and began filing water right claims on all of the major rivers that flowed into the Skagit, including the Baker, Cascade, and Sauk. In 1924, without fully studying the impact to salmon, the newly created Seattle City Light completed Gorge Dam on the Skagit River. More dams were built, the Diablo and Ross, each removing critical water needed for downstream salmon habitat. And so, by the end of the 1950s, 5 separate dams operated in the Skagit watershed. But this practice of using natural resources without considering the consequences would soon meet a formidable challenge. The catalyst was this book, Rachel Carson's landmark Silent Spring, published in 1962, which galvanized citizen concern for the natural world. By the end of the decade, the environmental movement had been born, resulting in laws that helped stem the tide of degradation. Among them were these. The last of which is the Wild and Scenic River Act, which the Skagit received that designation in 1978. And many of these others I'm sure you've heard about. Some may be surprised to see the inclusion of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty here, thinking it really didn't affect this neck of the woods. But it did, in fact, affect us. Not only was plutonium being processed east of the mountains in Hanford, where releases were made into the atmosphere without public knowledge, but also the radiation from nuclear testing in Nevada at the Nevada test site came north into areas of the Pacific Northwest. and the health implications are only now being able to be understood and dealt with. In 1968, an environmental jewel was preserved in Skagit County with the creation of North Cascades National Park. It was not a hit, however, with local businessmen who had lobbied for a Trans-Cascade highway since the 1920s. They would mount annual expeditions into the mountains and to encourage the state to build a highway. They felt that the creation of a national park locked up valuable sites for commercial development. Downstream, new threats took place in 1969 with proposals for a new source of power, nuclear plants. The first proposed plant was to be on Kicket Island on the west side of the Swinomish Reservation. The idea of a nuclear plant perched above the waters of Puget Sound outraged local citizens and fostered the first organizations in the county dedicated to environmental protection. SCAMP, or Skagitonians Concerned About Nuclear Plants, was one. They had their work cut out for them. The Kicket plant was only one of 4 nuclear plants proposed for the Skagit Valley, the others being on Samish Island and near Cedar-Woolley. SCAMP was born soon after these proposals became public, and note what they put on their official poster. The term Magic Skagit was born. And the Skagit County Commissioners voted to approve rezones of land to accommodate these nuclear plants. 3 things happened. In 1978, the Swinomish, Soxuyatl, and Upper Skagit tribes were allowed to intervene in the hearing process, protesting the threats to their treaty fishing grounds. In 1979, Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island nuclear plant experienced catastrophic failure and brought a new term, China syndrome, or a complete meltdown, to the vocabulary of ordinary Americans. And thirdly, SCAMP was able to get a citizens' advisory vote for the proposed nuclear plants on the fall election ballot. In November 1979, Skagitonians spoke loud and clear. Over 70% of voters said no to the nuclear plants. The nuclear turmoil in the valley coincided with alarm bells ringing in the Skagit watershed. Our canary in the mine shaft was in crisis. The legendary salmon of the Skagit, one of the few rivers to support all 6 species, faced critical conditions to the dismay of sports fishermen and their families, and to the local Indian population whose very culture and sustenance depended on them. They not only had to worry about declining salmon runs at this time, but also the ability to catch them without facing arrest. In the mid-1960s, the fish wars began on Puget Sound as natives deliberately fished in their treaty areas and courted arrest for doing so in order to bring this issue to the public eye. And while the fight in the Nisqually Basin, led by Billy Frank, gained the most attention, it got its start here in the Skagit Delta when Joe McCoy of Swinomish, shown here at the upper right, was arrested in 1960 for fishing on the river's North Fork. And although he initially won his case, as this headline in the Skagit Valley Herald shows, it was overturned by the Washington Supreme Court. McCoy's arrest and many others led to the landmark 1974 case U.S. v. Washington, where Judge George Bolt decreed that the 1855 treaties were to be honored and that Native Americans were entitled to half the fishing catch in the waters of our state. The Bolt decision would be repeatedly challenged by the state of Washington and ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, which upheld Bolt's ruling in 1979. The local reaction was, to put it mildly, not pleased. Skagitonians called for Bolt's impeachment. Native fishing boats were set on fire. And the county's major newspaper declared that Indian fishing treaties should no longer apply. But even though the fishing equation had changed dramatically for Native Americans, it did not improve the declining numbers of fish. The salmon crisis was real, as acknowledged by the State Department of Fisheries in 1948 with this report. That fact would lead to some of the biggest environmental battles in Skagit County history, as our canary in the coal mine kept singing and pointing to a key issue critical to a valley such as ours, the health of our waterways, beset by stormwater runoff carrying pollutants directly into our rivers and the Salish Sea. These pollutants, like heavy metals and PCBs, were a direct factor in salmon's declining numbers. And as this 2002 map illustrates, the source of contaminants in the region were numerous and sobering, as was the inability of salmon to return to their spawning grounds due to poorly designed highway culverts. In 2001, Washington tribes, including Swinomish, collectively sued Washington state to address the issue so that they would have fish to catch. The culvert litigation lasted 17 years, with the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ruling that Washington state would have to repair its culverts. But then there was the issue of the water itself, the very amount left in waterways to support salmon habitat. Again, this was an issue that had arisen in the 1940s and 50s when picnickers reported streams choked with dying salmon that had insufficient water to make it upstream to spawn. In the years before climate change became household words, alarm bells about the amount of water in local streams and rivers, known as the in-stream flow, were ringing loud and clear. This issue has filled Skagit County newspapers for the past 20 years, resulting in litigation and pain for property owners who found they were prohibited from drilling new wells that withdrew water from critically low water basins in the county. Low water levels and salmon health has directly led to another major environmental battle in the county since 2020, the relicensing of the Skagit River dams. The agreement, which is supposed to be completed this year, has been beset by disagreements over water levels in the Skagit, water temperature behind the dams, and fish passages, among other issues. As one writer put it, the Skagit Delta is where diverse interests converge: fish, farms, and now Seattle's endless need for hydroelectric power. But although Seattle gets the power from the Skagit's dams, the environmental impacts stay here. Meanwhile, as the federal census reflects, more and more people keep moving to the Skagit, drawn by its unparalleled beauty. More people means more cars, more land cleared for housing and businesses, more demands on our already fragile river ecosystem. The passage of the Growth Management Act by Washington State in 1990 aimed to mitigate growth and urban sprawl with careful planning. But it took multiple lawsuits to force compliance by Skagit County commissioners, many filed by this group, the Friends of Skagit County, formed in 1993. 20 years later, as the reality of unrestrained growth set in, the local newspaper eventually changed its support for the issue with this cartoon. As we face into our collective future, challenges no doubt await us, particularly with climate change looming overhead. It behooves us to remember that we have much to preserve here in the magic Skagit, not just our canary, the salmon, but our incomparable landscapes, water quality, wildlife, and open spaces, the places that bring us peace and repose. As we plan and act for what is to come, let us remember what came before. People that fought the hard battles to protect what is here so that we can enjoy it now. The commitment to do that for future generations will be us paying that work forward. Let's also be inspired by organizations like the Skagit Land Trust, whose founders are shown here, as well as the current director, Molly Doran, or an organization committed to protecting our environment. The Land Trust's partnerships with over 70 different entities build the vital connections that enable the hard work of protection and preservation to move forward. Today, the Land Trust protects over 10,000 acres in Skagit County. And let us remember that our support for that mission is critical to what lies ahead in Skagit County. And so is understanding what came before. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight, and we look forward to your questions and input. Thank you.
Theresa, that was an amazing range. You promised us, I think through 1980, 1990, 1980, I think was your range. And then you offered even more. You shared all of this more recent environmental change in Skagit County. So we really appreciate you managing to put so much great information into a really efficient talk. So thank you again for that. And I do want to just draw folks' attention to our next couple of presentations. We have Sean Bailing from, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Wetland Wildlife Species Specialist for Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And she'll be speaking, the title of her talk is Damn It, Beavers in Washington State. And that should be really interesting. That'll be on Earth Day, April 22nd from 6 p.m. to 7:30, also on Zoom. And we'll get a direct link for you so you don't have to register for Zoom next time. And then we have another talk coming up in May with Jack Hart, who I think is the former director of Deception Pass State Park and has done a whole lot of work for state parks. And then he's also co-author of the Hiking Close to Home guidebook. So he'll be talking to us about some of his favorite hikes in our area. And last thing I want to say is just thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Theresa, for sharing this really powerful history with our community. And thank you to everybody for your wonderful questions. And I think now is certainly a great time to learn from history. So I think this offering was really well timed. And I hope that we can learn from the original stewards of the lands, these lands, to care for the Skagit and hopefully create a better history for the generations to come and hopefully save some land for tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at our next speaker series talk. Thank you.